Ready? All right, Mr. Axelrod.
Thank you, Your Honor. Yesterday was really quick, so I didn't really get a proper chance to introduce myself. My name is Dave Axelrod. It's my privilege to represent CNN. For better or for worse, you all are going to hear a lot from me over the next 2 weeks. And just off the bat, we thank you for your attention and your service. Along with me, Joe Bailey sitting over there, Sandy Sanborn, and Chuck Tobin, who's somewhere around here, are the lawyers representing CNN. For me, the most important person in the courtroom is Gianni DeMezza back there, who makes sure all the documents go up well and make sure that we're doing everything the right way. And then, of course, Adam Levine, who is a senior vice president of news for CNN, is sitting there with us as well. And you'll be hearing from him testify later in this trial. But when you came in here, before you started hearing the instructions from the judge, and before you heard Mr. Roche, before you listened to me, you probably said to yourselves, why are we here? And the simple answer is we're here because in November 2021, CNN published 2 stories about Afghan evacuations. One was the video segment, which I'll show you in a couple minutes. And one was a written article that went up on CNN.com. So I'll refer to them as the segment and the article. And we're here because those 2 publications, the segment and the article, they were tough, but they were fair and they were accurate. That's what CNN's reporting was. After the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan in the fall of 2021, you're going to see the videos. Afghanistan was lawless chaos. People couldn't leave the country, and the Taliban was actively hunting Afghans who had worked with the U.S. military. Because of those horrible conditions, trapped Afghans, people who had helped the U.S. government for 2 decades, were forced to wait for the Taliban to find them and their families, or find a way to pay fees beyond their means to leave the country. Zachary Young was one of the private operators who saw these horrible conditions as a way to make money. You're going to hear, and you're going to see the documents, that there were many U.S. veterans, people who had served in Afghanistan, who volunteered. You're going to hear from General Young. Mr. Roche told you, he's going to come in, he's plaintiff's expert. He and his colleagues set up a very good volunteer veterans organization that evacuated like a couple thousand Afghans. You're going to hear about those wonderful volunteer veterans organizations who came in and did a good service. And you're going to hear about Mr. Young, who saw this desperation as a way to get rich. And he didn't hide it. He's here, we're here because CNN published a story. But what you're going to see and what the evidence is going to show is that over and over again, Mr. Young advertised his services on LinkedIn. I don't know if you all use LinkedIn. A lot more people use Facebook, but LinkedIn is a social network site for businesses, for individuals looking for jobs, for individuals looking to get hired. Mr. Young advertised his services over and over again on LinkedIn, directly to sponsors sometimes, that's American companies, and directly to Afghans. And you're going to see his exchanges with those Afghans where he says, it's $14,500 for me to get you out of Afghanistan, which is, you're going to hear, is way more than any Afghan could ever pay. You're going to see CNN put up his picture. That was the picture that Mr. Young chose to use on his LinkedIn site, that he put up with every one of his messages. Back home in the US, in the fall of 2021, we Americans watched as networks like CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all the big stations, they reported on those horrible conditions on the ground. They showed the desperation and the chaos that was left behind when our government withdrew our troops and the dangerous situation we left for those people who had helped us for 20 years. The segment and the article delivered this message. They delivered this message about those horrible and desperate conditions. Because of the failures of our government, Afghans who had pledged their loyalty to the U.S. were left with few good options. And you're going to see that part of that reporting was about Zach Young, his advertisements, and the people like him who saw this as nothing more than a way to make money. Every word you're going to see in CNN's reporting was true. Every word was accurate. And CNN's reporting was tough. But it was tough, and it was fair, and it was accurate. And that's what the evidence is going to show in this case. Now, since I was a younger man, when I had a lot less gray hair caused by trials and kids, I was a federal prosecutor, and I prosecuted white-collar fraud. Trials, I learned, were the best way to get to the truth. A lot of people say, oh, jurors come in, they don't know anything, they can't be trusted. Completely disagree. You all have the power of using your common sense, your combined wisdom, your combined life experiences to look at all the evidence and get to the truth of the matter. And that's what you're going to be asked to do in this case. We trust you to do it. They trust you to do it. It's the best system in the world. But the evidence is what's really important. Now, Mr. Roche just told you a story. And that's all it was. It was a good story, but it's all it was a story. I'm going to tell you a story. I hope it's as good as his. It might not be. But my opening is just a story too. Because opening statements, those are statements by lawyers, are not evidence. Nothing Mr. Roche said is evidence. Nothing I'm about to say is evidence. Rather, they're just competing views of what we think the evidence will show. And good lawyers, like Mr. Roche, they can tell you a story that isn't necessarily going to line up with the evidence. And I'm just going to give you one example, but you're going to see a lot more as you go through this trial. Now, Mr. Roche said there's a text or a Slack exchange where Mr. Marquardt says, we're going to nail this MFer. And he's right, there is. But what Mr. Roche didn't tell you is that 2 lines later in that same exchange, Mr. Marquardt says, or maybe he'll just slip away. But that's what good lawyers can do. They can tell you a story that doesn't necessarily line up with the evidence. So what all of us in this courtroom are going to ask you to do is pay incredibly close attention to the actual evidence in the case, rather than just relying on my story or Mr. Roche's story. Now, I'm not going to break my opening down by kind of segments, but I'm going to tell you that during this trial, you're going to learn three very critical things. In November 21, CNN published a TV segment and the online article that included references to Mr. Young. These stories, as you're going to see, were carefully researched. They were carefully written, and many experienced journalists at CNN put eyes on these stories. They put eyes on the stories to make sure they were accurate. They put eyes on the stories to make sure they were fair. And the first important thing you're going to learn in this case is that neither story accused Mr. Young of doing anything illegal. Indeed, the reporting on Young truthfully reported his own public advertisements on LinkedIn. And as you're going to see in a couple minutes, they were almost all his own words. That's the first important thing you're going to see. The second important thing you're going to see is that Mr. Young, who has the burden in this case, will present no witness other than himself who will testify that they interpreted the stories that Mr. Young claims are the way that he did. Not a single person. He won't bring one single person who says, I watched the segment, I read the article, I saw it the same way as Mr. Young. Not a single one. Third, Mr. Young, whose burden it is, will present no witness who will testify about Mr. Young's reputation before the CNN publications or afterwards. He won't have any witness who will testify that they thought less of Mr. Young or wouldn't hire him because of the CNN stories. Not a single one. And you heard Mr. Roche talk about Mr. Young's background. All this service, all these skills. The fact that plaintiff can't bring one witness to testify that they thought less of him or that they wouldn't hire him tells you all you need to know about his case. It's just not there. Those three things, that's the case in a nutshell. And maybe I should sit down, but I'm going to go a little bit further. So I'm going to put a little more meat on the bones of what you're going to see. In 2021, the Biden administration withdrew our troops from Afghanistan. It was a disaster, and the Taliban took immediate control. And maybe one area where CNN and Mr. Young agree is that the conditions on the ground in Afghanistan were abhorrent. The Taliban is a repressive terrorist organization. It persecutes minority groups like Christians. It doesn't allow women basic freedoms. And third, it vowed to punish any Afghan who would work with the US government. So as the US pulled out, you'll see the videos, desperate Afghans fled to the airport. And you may have seen the video, they're like clinging on cargo planes. It's one of the most sad and horrifying images you can see. And then there was a suicide bombing at the airport. And 13 American service members lost their life, and 170 Afghans were killed. And that is the desperation that CNN did a ton of reporting on. But in the wake, so America leaves Afghanistan in that period. And in the wake of leaving Afghanistan, thousands of Afghans were trapped. And these three groups, women, minorities, US loyal people, they faced assaults, they faced imprisonments, they faced death or worse because they dared to help the United States or because they were women who enjoyed basic freedoms for the last 20 years. So as I said, nonprofits and veterans groups started organizing volunteer campaigns immediately. And these noble people donated their time, worked their contacts, raised money from Americans in the United States, and charged those Afghans nothing for that. CNN covered the Afghanistan withdrawal extensively. In the lead up to the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the months that followed, CNN covered the dire situation on the ground. CNN reported on the policy failures by the Biden administration, both before and after the withdrawal. CNN reported on the brutal conditions imposed by the Taliban after the withdrawal. CNN reported on the suicide attacks at the airport. CNN reported on the danger that Afghans who helped the US faced under the Taliban. Most importantly, for why we're here, CNN reported on evacuations. CNN ran multiple stories on evacuations during this period. CNN dedicated hours and hours of coverage to the situation in Afghanistan because, as awful as it is seeing images of people clinging to airplanes and people facing horrible persecution by the Taliban, this is a story that we as Americans need to see because it was a policy failure that left people who were our friends in dire situation. And I know it's trite to say, but the saying goes, if we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And that's what CNN was doing. It was showing Americans what was going on the ground. Alex Marquardt, who's going to be someone you're going to hear from in this case, you're going to see his name a ton. Mr. Roche mentioned him a bunch. He's a CNN reporter. He covers national security. He's been a professional reporter for nearly 20 years. During his time at CNN and before that at ABC News, Alex reported from war zones all over the world. This is what he's dedicated his life to: the Ukraine, Libya, Syria, Israel, Gaza. He's reported live from all of them, bringing these news from those conflict zones to our TVs. You're going to hear that he lived in the Middle East for 6 years, reporting on numerous conflicts in the region. He's been to Afghanistan, and he's reported from Afghanistan. He's exactly the reporter you would turn to cover this type of dire situation and help explain it to Americans. Indeed, after the Taliban took over, he did a number of stories about Afghan evacuations. He ran a story on US evacuations of Afghan interpreters who helped the US. He did a story on the evacuation of Afghan pilots who trained with the US military. He did a story on the CIA's role in evacuating a female Afghan American who had been volunteering in Kabul when Kabul fell. So in October, just after the withdrawal, Alex received information about people charging a lot of money for evacuations, $15,000 per person, which, as you'll hear to an Afghan, is just an unbelievably large amount of money. He believed, and you'll hear it from him, that it was important to report on the high prices people were charging desperate Afghans to escape death. And you'll see, one of the people that Alex learned of was Zachary Young. Alex saw Young's communications with multiple people, and so he started looking into it. And he quickly saw Young's advertisements plastered all over LinkedIn. So through the second half of October and into November, Alex Marquardt reported. He's a reporter, that's what he did. He talked to volunteers in Afghanistan and the United States who were trying to help Afghans. He talked to Afghans in Afghanistan desperate to get out. He talked to an Afghan in the US desperate to get his family out of Afghanistan. And you're going to hear that Alex wasn't working the story alone. There's another reporter, her name's Katie Bo-Lillis. She's also a national security reporter. And she helped Alex out. And you're going to hear that in the midst of Alex kind of looking at this story, looking at Mr. Young, Katie Bo-Lillis learns about Mr. Young completely independently because he is so far out there on LinkedIn, sending these advertisements to everyone, trying to make as much money off the situation as he can. It's only when Mr. Marquardt and Ms. Lillis showed each other the information that they had, they realized that they were both heard about Mr. Young independently. And here's exactly what Mr. Marquardt and Ms. Lillis saw and what you're going to see in this case. Mr. Young was advertising to everyone on LinkedIn. He was charging over $14,000 a person to evacuate Afghans. He was promising people visas if they evacuated to certain countries. They saw communications where Mr. Young communicated directly with desperate Afghans. They saw communications where when Mr. Young was communicating with those Afghans, as soon as they said they didn't have a sponsor, Mr. Young would just stop responding. They saw communications where Mr. Young berated other Americans who had the gall to question what he was doing. Mr. Roche talked about one of those where he called this woman, Jill Kornetsky, a spiteful bee. They saw messages where Mr. Young represented that he could secure Afghans' refugee status. And you're going to hear from Ms. Lillis and Mr. Marquardt that this especially caught their attention. Because of their experience reporting on Afghanistan and war-torn countries, they knew it was incredibly unlikely to be a promise that Mr. Young could actually keep. And you're going to hear Mr. Young's own testimony. He had no idea if he could give people refugee status, but he was out there making those representations himself. Now, Mr. Roche talked about some of the internal communications at CNN, where Mr. Marquardt and others made callous observations about Mr. Young. You're going to see that those weren't made in a vacuum. They were made when the CNN reporters saw how Mr. Young callously replied to a question about his prices. That if Afghan can't pay his prices, they should run for the border and see how far they get. And let's put that comment in context. You have desperate Afghans who are being persecuted. And when Mr. Young was questioned about his pricing, he told this person, have them run for the border and see how far they get. That was one of the comments that Mr. Marquardt and Ms. Lillis were responding to. Another one was where Mr. Young cussed out that volunteer, Jill Kornetsky, told her to F off, and then called her a spiteful bee because she had the gall to question his pricing. You're going to see those communications between Mr. Marquardt and Ms. Lillis. We're not hiding from them. But you're going to see as those two reporters learned more and more about Mr. Young, and they saw the seemingly impossible promises that he was making on LinkedIn, they expressed their disdain for him. And you're going to hear directly from them why they said those things. You're going to hear that from their perspective as reporters who have worked in war zones and seen true human despair, that Mr. Young's comments were completely offensive. Now, over the weeks that they worked the story, Mr. Marquardt and Ms. Lillis communicated with Mr. Young multiple times. They wanted to hear from Young. You're going to see that. They were trying to gather as much information for their story as they could possibly. You're going to see a very extensive back and forth on November 3rd of 2021, 8 days before the stories air, between Ms. Lillis and Mr. Young. They had a long back and forth where Katie Bo-Lillis repeatedly asked Mr. Young to jump on the phone and talk to her. Mr. Young declined, but he kept texting back and forth. And you're going to see that Mr. Marquardt called Mr. Young on November 3rd, but he didn't answer. You're going to see that Mr. Marquardt texted Mr. Young on November 10th, but he didn't respond. And you're going to see that on November 11th, Mr. Marquardt reached out to Young, and he again didn't want to answer questions about his pricing. Mr. Young had no obligation to talk to CNN. But as you'll see, there can be no dispute, and we're going to go through it carefully, that CNN didn't try to learn as much as possible from Mr. Young as they could. And so I want to kind of talk about two things that Mr. Roche talked about. First, he said that until November 11th, right before the story happened, Mr. Young had no idea that CNN was working on a story about him. This could not be less true. You're going to see the back and forth between Ms. Lillis and Mr. Young on November 3rd, 8 days before the story, where Mr. Young threatens to sue CNN because he says, I already know what this story is about. The other fallacy that Mr. Roche talked about is this idea that Mr. Young didn't have enough time to respond. You're going to hear Mr. Young admit when he takes the stand that he actually didn't need more time to respond to the questions that Mr. Marquardt asked him. They were all very simple questions. And you're going to hear Mr. Young say, oh yeah, I could have answered that question in a second. I could have answered that question in a second. You're going to see, and the evidence is going to show, that over the course of 8 days before the publication, it became very clear to CNN that Mr. Young was going to give limited, false information to CNN, and that at the end, he was just trying to stonewall the story. So after about 2 to 3 weeks of reporting, Mr. Marquardt drafted the segment for a show on CNN called The Lead with Jake Tapper. Over a period of days, Mr. Marquardt wrote and produced this 4-minute segment. The story, and I'm going to show it to you in a second, because this is a defamation case, and defamation cases are about the publications. The story, as you'll see, focused on the terrible situation on the ground for Afghans looking to flee. As part of the story, Mr. Marquardt interviewed two Afghan men, who talked about their efforts to flee and to help family members get out. One Afghan, located in California, we'll hear from him in a second, told Alex he was desperate to get his family out. They were being targeted by the Taliban because his mother was a doctor who helped our service members. And how this man turned to someone on Facebook, not Mr. Young, who he'd heard was evacuating people. And when he begged for that man's help, he was told it would cost $10,000 a person to get his family of 10 out of Afghanistan, which was, of course, more money than he could possibly find. That wasn't about Mr. Young. You're going to hear that. Mr. Marquardt then interviewed another Afghan who worked as a contractor with the U.S. and who was still in Afghanistan. And that man spoke about how he met with someone in Afghanistan who wanted $50,000 to get his family on a flight list. That was also not about Mr. Young. The third minute of this 4-minute TV segment focuses on Mr. Young. And the story says that Mr. Young is charging $14,000 a person on LinkedIn, and it shows his LinkedIn posts where he advertises his services. And then the story ends, and you'll see it, with Mr. Young saying that he only expects payments from sponsors. Those were the words that he gave Katie Bo-Lillis, and CNN included his words in the story. Most importantly, what you're going to see about the segment is it never says Mr. Young's doing anything criminal. It never implies Mr. Young's doing anything criminal. The story says that Mr. Young is charging a lot of money to get people out of Afghanistan, and it uses his own words, only his own words, to explain that. Everything in the story, we're going to walk through it in a minute, everything the story reports about Mr. Young came directly from his posts on LinkedIn, or things he said directly to people on LinkedIn, or things he said directly to CNN. His own words. Now, I'm going to put up the segment for you. G, can you just cue it up? DX 111. This is a defamation case. And you may ask why plaintiffs didn't show you the segment in their presentation. They had an hour to make a presentation. They went about 40 minutes. They chose not to show it to you. Because when you actually watch the segment and you actually look at the article, you'll see that there's no there. So I implore you, watch the segment carefully. Watch it as many times as you can during this trial. Read the article carefully, because you're going to see that there's nothing false about Mr. Young in any of it. So, Mr. DeMezza, could we cue that up? Let it rip.
In our worldly today, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, says that as of last week, it had assisted in the departure of at least 377 U.S. citizens and
stop real quick?
279 lawful permanent.
Can you all hear that?
No.
Is there a way that we,
Is there a way we can bump it up? I'm sorry, the sound in the video itself is a little funky, so we're just trying to work through it.
In our worldly today, the U.S.
You pause it there?
government, the Biden.
Is that a little bit better?
It's about the same.
Yeah, just 1 second. We're going to work through this, and hopefully we have a better solution tomorrow. But for some reason, we can't get it louder right now. So I'm going to try to be really quiet. Hopefully you all can do your best.
In our worldly today, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, says that as of last week, it had assisted in the departure of at least 377 U.S. citizens and 279 lawful permanent residents of the U.S. from Afghanistan since August 31st. Still, many Afghans who desperately want to flee Taliban rule, and Afghans who say their lives are at stake, they remain behind. As CNN's Alex Marquardt has discovered, Afghans trying to get out of the country face a black market full of promises, demands of exorbitant fees, and no guarantee of safety or success.
Stop it right there. So that is the first 40 seconds of the video. As you can see, it's a discussion of the U.S. evacuating Americans and a lack of options for Afghans who want to leave. And you'll see that this thing at the bottom is called the banner. We'll refer to that through this trial. You'll see that the banner says Afghans trying to flee Taliban face black markets, exorbitant fees, etc. As you can see in this first 40 seconds of this video, nothing about Mr. Young.
These are the heavy steps of a young man trying to save his family. He's just 26 years old and lives in California. We can't show his face for the safety of his family in Afghanistan.
I'm desperate, the danger is imminent.
Since the chaotic international withdrawal from Afghanistan, his parents, siblings, and wife have been in hiding from the Taliban, who in the past, the young man says, have violently beaten his father, a doctor, and been angry with his mother, a women's rights activist who worked with the U.S.
Taliban left announcement to my parents that anybody who helped them find my parents or my family that ends up with their execution will gain a prize.
They put a bounty on your family's head.
Exactly. This is really serious. They went to our house. They destroyed every single thing.
Desperate, he turned to Facebook, finding people offering ways to get Afghans out of the country for a price.
That person came up to me and told me, hey, you know what, you got to pay $10,000 per person in order to be evacuated then.
Per person?
9, 10 people. It would be like $100,000, and I cannot provide $100,000 in cash. In a way, like even if I provide that money, there is no guarantee that they will be evacuated.
According to Afghans and activists we've spoken with, desperate Afghans are now being exploited, like that young man, told that they can get them or their families out if they pay exorbitant, often impossible amounts.
So that's the first interview that goes on in the story. We're now up to 210 on the story. As you just saw, the first interview features this man in California who was talking to someone on Facebook, not Mr. Young. And the story is all about how Afghans are desperate and stuck, and that people are charging prices that no Afghan could pay. And we're now 2 minutes, 10 seconds in. Mr. Young's name has not been mentioned at all.
Only one family, $50,000.
We Skyped with a father of 3 in Kabul who had just met with a man offering to get them on an evacuation flight list.
They want to leave the country. If you say yes, they're going to say, okay, pay first. I said, how we can pay that much money right now? It's only business matters. People are making $100,000 per day.
This man, whose identity we also need to hide, worked as a contractor for USAID. He's a special interest visa applicant for the U.S. The kind of Afghan citizen the Biden administration says they're working to evacuate. What is the U.S. doing that you know of to try to get you and your family out?
Unfortunately, they are not doing now anything. Up to 31st, they said everything is closed and it's finished. We did not receive anything back from U.S. Embassy or from any other organization.
We are now 3 minutes and 2 seconds in this story. We've now interviewed a second Afghan person. That guy is in Afghanistan. Focused on people offering desperate Afghans flights out of the country, as you heard. He worked as a contractor for the U.S. government, and it's highlighting the fact that the U.S. government's not doing enough. That's the focus of the story.
So he went online, where he found a man named Zachary Young, who was one of many advertising evacuations from Afghanistan, posting just this.
Stop it there. So now we're at 3:10 in the story, and Mr. Young is first introduced. And so you'll see, we just saw his picture, but that was the same picture from LinkedIn. That's where CNN got it. And as you'll see, this is his open advertisements to anyone, including Afghans, on LinkedIn. And see, the first thing CNN does is it highlights his own words. If you are a sponsor with funding, series to evacuate people from Afghanistan on short notice, please reach out. We can provide references and we can deliver. So you can see, in the very first thing CNN says about Mr. Young, they're highlighting his words, where in this one, he's saying, if you are a sponsor, contact me. A sponsor being an American company or an NGO looking to pay for Afghans to get out. Mr. Nemex?
We can deliver. One LinkedIn user.
So again, we go to a next part of Mr. Young. I'm going to rewind it and play it in full again. But the next thing that's highlighted about Mr. Young, again, his own words. And this was a conversation Mr. Young had with someone before he deleted it. And you can hear about that in a second. And so this is the conversation. Yes, what are you charging and where does this get her? Mr. Young responds, $75,000 for one vehicle, 5 to 6 passengers, Kabul to Peshawar, can also facilitate passports and visits and transit to Dushanbe, but again, it costs money. Again, these are his own words. This was somebody asking him, what are you charging? And these are the prices that he is giving. $75,000 for a vehicle, for a ride. Mr. Nemex, can start again?
Posted messages with Young,
You could actually just
where
go
Young
back
said
a couple
it would,
seconds. Go back like 10 seconds. Thank you.
It was one of many advertising evacuations from Afghanistan, posting just this week, we can deliver. One LinkedIn user posted messages with Young, where Young said it would be $75,000 for a car to Pakistan. He told another it would be $14,500 per person to get to the United Arab Emirates, or Albania for another $4,000. Prices well.
So again, now this is the third thing talking about Mr. Young. Again, this was another advertisement that he made on LinkedIn. You see there's his face. Now he's charging flights for $14,500 per person. And you're going to hear in this trial that Mr. Young never evacuated anyone by flight. He promises a 4-month visa in the United Arab Emirates. You're going to hear that he had no idea how he would ever do that. Then he says, sponsor needs to arrange onward travel. So a sponsor could arrange onward travel, or we can offer onward to Albania for an additional $4,000, which includes refugee status on arrival. So again, this is Mr. Young's own words, offering to Afghans and everyone that he can arrange refugee status in a country called Albania. And then you can see at the bottom, he says, if they have no passport, the price is an additional $1,000. Mr. Young's own words, CNN found them, they published them. But just to be very clear, this is what Mr. Young had put up on LinkedIn before CNN published it. Right?
Beyond the reach of most Afghans. We got Young's number and called, but he didn't pick up. In a text message, he told CNN that Afghans trying to leave are expected to have sponsors pay for them. If someone reaches out, we need to understand if they have a sponsor behind them to be able to pay evacuation costs, which Young says are highly volatile and based on environmental reality.
Stop it right there. Thank you. Now, as we're getting towards the end of the 1 minute of this story, which is about Mr. Young, this was the comment that he made to CNN when they spoke to him about reporting. And this was his comment saying, if someone reaches out, we need to understand if they have a sponsor behind them to be able to pay evacuation costs. CNN took the quote that Mr. Young had given CNN during its reporting and put it in the story. That was Mr. Young's explanation for why he was charging so much money, and CNN used it. That's the information he gave.
Young repeatedly declined to break down the costs or say if he's making money. Back in California, Young...
And so now it's 3:58. The 1 minute portion about Mr. Young of this 4 minute story is over until the very end. Thank you, Mr. Meza.
Afghan American tells us even though he can't pay, he's still pleading to get his family out.
I have sent tons of texts asking these people, begging them to evacuate my family. If I don't be able to evacuate them within the next 2 weeks, I think I will lose them all. I think I will lose them all, my family.
And just moments ago, that young man told me that the Taliban has now issued summons for his family in hiding, indicating his father believes that the Taliban really is after them. Now, the Biden administration continues to work on evacuating people, but as you can see there are just so many more Afghans who want to get out of the country, and that just drives prices higher and higher. In another message, that person offering those evacuations, Zachary Young, he wrote, availability is extremely limited and demand is high. Jake, he goes on to say, that's how economics works, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Alex Marquardt, thanks so much for that important report. Coming up, Xi Jinping's power play, the new move from the...
That is the entire segment, why we're here, the first half of why we're here. And as you can see, when the story ends, again, CNN uses Mr. Young's own words. Things he was fine with saying. That's how economics works, unfortunately. Now, the evidence is going to show that after Mr. Marquardt wrote that script for the segment that the lead played, it went through CNN's extensive vetting process. And in this review process, commonly referred to as the triad, senior experienced editors with no prior involvement in the case independently review the script to ensure that it's fit for publication. And they use independent people because they want to make sure that we're testing it out, right? We're making sure that it's accurate. We're making sure that it's fair. There are two important components of the triad that we're going to talk about. The first is the row, where one senior editor checks the story to make sure it's factually accurate. That means if we're making assertions in the segment, can we say this? Do we have the support for it? CNN ran this story through that process. The second is called standards and practices. And that's where a different senior editor reviews the story and decides, okay, it's accurate, but is it fair? Is it something that we should publish? And you're going to hear from that editor, Emma Lacey Bordeaux, and you're going to hear that she thought the story was fair. You're going to hear and see from these experienced editors who did an independent review of the TV segment, and together, after much discussion and back and forth, confirm that the segment was fit for publication. And the point of this process is to ensure that CNN's reporting is fair and it's accurate. You're going to hear that all these people believe the story fairly and accurately depicted the conditions the desperate Afghans were facing, and it was entirely appropriate and fair to talk about Mr. Young's own advertising campaign. You're going to hear that they believe the story fairly described how Young was trying to profit off of human misery. You're also going to hear that they had no intention of publishing a segment that conveyed Mr. Young was doing anything illegal. You're going to hear it directly from them. Mr. Roche used the word sensational. I lost track. It was 3 or 4 times. There is no evidence in this case that there was anything sensational about the story. You all saw it. The headline wasn't American targets Afghans or ex-CIA, guy in Vienna, super spy targets Afghans. It had none of that. It's a 4-minute story that doesn't mention Zachary Young until the 3rd minute. Moreover, you're going to hear that the Jake Tapper show runs from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. on the East Coast. Now, if you were running a sensational story, you'd probably lead with this, something like that. This is a big story, a big expose we got. This story played at approximately 5:30 p.m., right in the middle of the 2nd hour. Not exactly the time slot you would use to draw viewers with sensationalized reporting. You're going to hear, the evidence is going to show that the TV story, the segment, never said Mr. Young was doing anything illegal. Mr. Young contends that using the phrase black market in the banner implied he was. You're going to hear from Mr. Young. You're going to hear from Mr. Young's expert. You're going to hear from the CNN witnesses that the term black market was a perfect description of the market the Afghans were facing to get out of the country. That banner played throughout the story. It played long before the story focused on Young and when it was up after Mr. Young's portion. But black market was a perfect way to describe what was going on in Afghanistan. You're going to hear from Zachary Young himself that after the brutal Taliban captured the country, women couldn't move around. If you wanted to get a woman out of the country, like Mr. Young was doing, you had to use safe houses. You had to use covert moves. You're going to hear Mr. Young testify that he was so concerned about security with people on the ground that he deleted his messages. Now, if this were a situation where a woman who wanted to get out of Afghanistan because it was brutal could simply go to the airport, get on her phone, use Expedia, there would be no reason for Mr. Young to have a job. There would be no black market. But the black market, in this case, was created because the Taliban wasn't letting people leave, and people were actually threatened with harm, death, or even worse if they stayed. If you were a desperate Afghan looking to flee, you needed to find an operator like Mr. Young and then hide from the Taliban until you could be moved out of the country. And you're going to hear all that. Black market was an absolutely accurate way to describe the situation in Afghanistan. And as you're going to see in the instructions, when we finally get there, that when you evaluate what words mean in these stories, you look at them in context. And in the context of this story, what you just saw, black market was a perfect way to describe the situation. It described the situation and it said nothing about illegality. So we're almost done. After the TV segment airs, Mr. Marquardt drafted an article for CNN's website. And the evidence will show that at that time, CNN had a completely different process for editing a TV segment and for editing a digital article. So different people at CNN worked on both. So on the afternoon of November 11th, Mr. Marquardt sends his draft article off to a digital editor, someone who hadn't been involved. His name's Mr. Tom Lumley. Mr. Roche talked about him, with the hopes that the story could be published the same day. The written story could be published at the same time as the TV segment. And you're going to hear from Mr. Lumley very frankly that he thought the TV segment was good, but the written article needed more work. And he was very frank about it. He didn't like it. He didn't like the written story that Mr. Marquardt had crafted. And so you're going to see that over the next 2 days, from November 11th to November 13th, Mr. Lumley revised the article, and he revised it pretty substantially. And he sent it through the triad process again to make sure that it was fit for production, fit for publication. And only when that team and that triad independently reviewed and approved it again was it published on November 13th, 2 days later. And now you heard Mr. Young's lawyer, you heard Mr. Roche talk about Mr. Lumley's complaints about the story. And you're going to see that he said the story is filled with holes like Swiss cheese, and he didn't like it, and it was half a story. And Mr. Lumley thought there was more of a story to tell. That's his main complaint. You're going to hear that from him. But you're also going to hear Mr. Lumley say that he thought the story was accurate as it related to Mr. Young. We're not hiding from Mr. Lumley. Mr. Lumley's comments about the story, the written story, and that it needed work, are direct evidence that CNN employed a rigorous process. That editors at CNN had free rein to speak up and say, hey, let's slow down, hold on. Before we publish, let's make sure this is better. It shows CNN's editors weren't a rubber stamp. They were carefully considering the work product and speaking up where they believed they needed to. So let's look at the article now, which is the second piece of this case. Mr. DeMeza, we won't have a sound problem with the article. This is the article, and you can just see the headline first. Some Afghans trying to flee country face exorbitant costs as Blinken touts success of efforts to help Americans. So right from the jump, again, this does not look like a sensational headline. I mean, many people may be fans of Tony Blinken, the soon-to-be ex-Secretary of State, but wouldn't say this is a sensationalized headline. But as you can see, it's a slightly different focus from the segment because it's focusing on Blinken and the efforts to help Americans. So let's look at the first page of the article. If you can blow that up, Mr. DeMeza, thank you. So these are the first two paragraphs of the story that was ultimately published. Afghans desperate to flee the country are increasingly having to negotiate with private operators charging exorbitant sums, while U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced on Friday that all Americans who have asked to leave Afghanistan have been offered an opportunity to do so. So that first paragraph, which in reporting is like, the first two paragraphs are the most important thing. They tell the reader what the story is going to be about, is that this is about the government trying to get Americans out of Afghanistan. It goes on to say there are fewer than 100 American citizens in Afghanistan who are ready to leave, according to the State Department. And Blinken said Friday that there are a couple hundred more for now who want to stay. That's the first page. Let's go to the second page. If you could blow up the top half, Mr. DeMeza. Yeah, keep going down until above. There's no guarantee. Yeah, thank you. So this is the second page. But in addition to those Americans, there are countless Afghans, including thousands who worked for or aided the U.S. during the 20-year war or believe they are in danger of being targeted by the Taliban or frantically trying to leave. The increased sense of desperation and limited space on evacuation routes have fostered a private market with private operations demanding exorbitant sums, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, to transport people outside the country by different means and routes with no guarantee of success. The operators include individuals and groups both inside and outside of Afghanistan, often contacted on social media. Then the next paragraph talks about a family of 10 hiding in Western Afghanistan. And then as you see, you go down, the 26-year-old who was in California turned to Facebook. So this is repeating the interview from the segment. And there's some of his quotes. So Mr. Meza, if you can go back up to the full page. Now grab the bottom. It's getting worse now because it's becoming normalized and desperation has grown, says Hazami Barmada, a humanitarian aid worker who has organized flights out of Afghanistan. So now this is something new that's been added to the digital piece. And you're going to hear that telling a story on TV and doing digital reporting is slightly different. You have more room in an article to include content. And so now this is an interview with this, I'm going to butcher names and I apologize in advance, Hazami Barmada, who's a humanitarian aid worker. And that's what this is focusing on. But then you see at the bottom, in Kabul, a father is hiding with his wife and 3 young boys, changing locations every 2 weeks and asking others to drop off his son at school so he's not seen. And so now we're going to go into the next page, but now this is referring to the second interview that was done in the TV segment. You go to the third page, Mr. Meza. If you could blow up the top. Yeah, thank you. All the way down to, that's fine. All the way down to that's how economics work. Thank you. And so you start at the top. Again, looking at this second paragraph, last week he says he met with a man in Kabul who told him it would be $50,000 to get his family on a list for an evacuation flight. And he kind of talks about the process that he's going through. So that's the second interview. So this is very much like the segment. Now down at the bottom, the very last paragraph before we get to the jump says, like the young Afghan American in California, the father tried multiple avenues. On LinkedIn, he spotted posts by Zachary Young, who repeatedly advertised evacuations to Afghanistan, promising this week, "We can deliver." Young appears to have at least recently spent time in Austria, communicated on an Austrian number, and met someone in Vienna who CNN spoke with. So, as you can see, Mr. Young, much like the TV segment, is not mentioned until the third page of the article. And he's not mentioned, and you can count it up, he's not mentioned until 20 paragraphs into the story. And anyone who got bored reading the first 2 pages would never even have seen his name. Again, we're going to, if we can go back to the main document and just blow up that last bottom part. When asked about his prices, Young responded to several people on the site, it's referring to LinkedIn, that a car from Kabul into Pakistan would be $75,000 or $14,500 per person for a flight to the UAE. To get to Albania with refugee status, Young said would be $4,000 more. So again, this is now the reference to Young quoting his exact words that he made on LinkedIn. And then they say, Mr. Young says, per person is expensive because availability is extremely limited and demand is high. He told the person who shared his messages with CNN. That's how economics works, unfortunately. Again, these are Mr. Young's own words. If we go to the 4th page, please. Yeah, if you can blow that up. Grab the top, please. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there you go. Go all the way down. Yeah, thank you. Young declined to speak on the phone, but sent in a text message that he asked Afghans who want to leave to have sponsors to cover them. If someone reaches out, we need to understand if they have a sponsor behind them to be able to pay evacuation costs. So again, that was a statement that Mr. Young made to Katie Bo-Lillis about who he expects to pay. And he's saying, we expect sponsors to pay. And CNN included his own words that he had provided to CNN. And that's the article. And so, you can take that down, Mr. Meza. The segment was up on November 11th. The article ran on November 13th. And for 5 months after this, November, December, January, February, until mid-March, no one, not Mr. Young, not anyone else, said to CNN, you got a problem with this story. It's defaming Mr. Young. Nothing. 5 months in the middle of March, 5 months after the story ran, November, December, January, February, March, Mr. Young sends a notice to CNN saying, hey, black market defames me. It took him 5 months. And upon seeing that notice, CNN did a retraction. And it apologized directly to Mr. Young for using the term black market. And CNN issued that apology because it did not intend to imply that Mr. Young was doing anything illegal. And you're going to hear that CNN issued that apology because it never considered that Mr. Young or anyone else would take that implication from the story. You're also going to see that the correction that CNN did was viewed by more viewers on CNN than the first story on Jake Tapper's The League was. It was viewed like by 800,000 people. Did CNN say Mr. Young did anything illegal? Absolutely not. You saw it. Were Mr. Young's advertisements and his efforts to get people out of Afghanistan newsworthy? Absolutely so. Now, you're going to hear from Mr. Young himself that at about the time Mr. Young begins talking to lawyers, and this is December, so about a month after the publications, he did something remarkable. He took his phone and he took screenshots of the things that he wanted to save, communications that he thought were helpful to his case. And then he deleted everything else related to Afghanistan. You're going to see that Mr. Young was advertising on LinkedIn and communicating with people on LinkedIn about evacuations, and he deleted all of those records after he was meeting with lawyers to bring a case against CNN. And when we get done with this case, I'm going to come back and ask you to make certain findings about what that means. But you know the truth already. He deleted those records because he knew if he was bringing a case, he was going to have to produce those things, and it wasn't going to help. You're also going to see that during this case, Mr. Young's going to say that CNN's reporting caused professional contacts of his not to communicate with him anymore. You're going to see that Mr. Young deleted all of his contact information for all of those people. You're going to see that he didn't keep any records of his communications with those people. You're going to see that he actually did some of these deletions after he filed this lawsuit. And this goes back to my point about him not bringing a single witness who's going to testify about his reputation or the fact that they thought less of him. He's not going to do that because there is no one. But he also made it impossible for CNN to actually go and find those people. He deleted those records because he didn't want you to see those communications because he knew it wouldn't help his case. As you heard from Mr. Young's lawyers, he contends the segment in the article implied he was operating illegally and he was taking money from Afghans. And I've talked a lot about this. I'm about to sit down. Well, let's talk about what you're not going to see during this trial. You heard Mr. Young's lawyer. He claimed that Mr. Young was this first-class professional. All this experience, deep professional contacts. Mr. Young is not going to call a single witness who will testify they interpreted the CNN segments the way he does. Mr. Young's not going to call a single witness who will testify that they thought less of Mr. Young because of the CNN segments. You're not going to see a single witness who will testify that they thought the story implied anything false about Mr. Young besides him. With contacts like he claims he had, it surely would be easy to find someone who would support your case. You won't hear any of this from Mr. Young because what he claims is not true. So through this trial, you're going to hear and see the following things. You're going to see that the situation, as we both described in Afghanistan, was lawless, it was chaotic, and it was desperate. And you're going to see that CNN's reporting, as we just saw, was fair and it was accurate. And you're not going to see a single witness who interpreted Mr. Young's, who interpreted the CNN reporting the way Mr. Young claims. And you're not going to see a single witness who will testify that they thought less of Mr. Young or wouldn't hire him. Simply put, for those three reasons, Mr. Young will not be able to meet his burden of proving his case. And for all of those reasons, in a lot more detail that we're going to get into, and I'm going to sit down now and we're going to start with this case. For all of those reasons, at the end of this trial, once all the testimony is complete, once you've had a chance to actually look at the exhibits, hear the witnesses, hear what they thought, I'm going to come back and ask you to return the only verdict that is supported by the evidence. And that's that CNN is not liable for defaming Mr. Young. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. We all appreciate it. Thank you.
And if you want to call your first witness.